Thank you for being here with us this morning, whether you're joining in person or through the live stream. We'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. We collectively acknowledge that Michigan State University occupies the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, Three Fires Confederacy of the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi peoples. In particular, the university resides on land ceded in the 1819 Treaty of Saginaw. We recognize, support, and advocate for the sovereignty of Michigan's 12 federally recognized Indian nations, for historic Indigenous communities in Michigan, for Indigenous individuals and communities who live here now, and for those who were forcibly removed from their homelands. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold Michigan State University more accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous people. Again, thank you for being here, for joining us, whether in person or through the live stream, for Dr. Asia Martinez lecture as the keynote speaker for the East Central Writing Centers Association Conference, and as the final speaker in the Storytelling is Activism speaker series, which has been a collaboration between ECWCA and the Writing Center at Michigan State during this past academic year. I'm Dr. Grace Pregent. I'm Associate Director in the Writing Center at Michigan State and ECWCA Conference Chair. You've received many emails from me at this point. Before I introduce Dr. Martinez, I'd like to welcome you again and to thank the many people who made this conference happen. Planning this conference has made me grateful for the generosity and resilience of Writing Center folks. I actually really have enjoyed corresponding with all of you over the past several months during this process. From the early months when I received emails like, "Are we really going to be in person? Seriously?" I'm like, seriously, that's the plan. To the middle months when we all debated presentation modalities together. Many of you in the past weeks have reached out simply to say, "Hey, I've chaired a conference before. Thank you for doing it. If you need anything at all, just let me know." You've been so generous with us as we've pulled this together and made this happen, and I appreciate that. Thank you to all the people involved in this conference, including the cross-institutional submission reviewers, the writing consultants and administrators at MSU, the ASL interpreters who are with us now, Uno Deuce, who's managing the live stream for us, the Kellogg conference staff, the many IT folks involved in all the different spaces, the Language Media Center, the Writing, Rhetoric, and American Cultures Department, the College of Arts and Letters, and our conference coordinator, Josh Kim, who could not be with us here today, but without whom this would never have happened. So please join me in thanking them. As an internal conference committee planning this, it consisted of many MSU undergraduates and graduate writing consultants. We began meeting nearly 2 years ago, and all through Zoom, to plan the conference. We talked a lot. We talked about stories as a way to inform cultures, change individual and collective action, create community, and transform public opinion. We talked about stories as a way of knowing. We talked about Writing Center ecologies and the communities and institutions of which we are part, and the stories we tell, the stories that confine and constrain us, and the stories we want to tell about the work of Writing Centers. We began reflecting on the banyan tree, which would become our conference logo, and the interdependence of all living things. We talked for months, and then, almost as soon as we decided the direction for the conference, critically imagining Writing Centers, stories, counterstories, and futures, we immediately knew we wanted to ask Dr. Asia Martinez to be our keynote speaker. Many of us had read and taught her work, and we're still thinking about it, particularly a plea for critical race theory counterstory. We weren't sure if she would say yes. We weren't sure if travel would be possible, depending upon the pandemic. And so we're particularly grateful that we get to be together here with Dr. Martinez for the first ECWCA conference, since many of us attended ECWCA at Marian University over 2 years ago now. Hopefully, many of you will also be with us at ECWCA next year, ECWCA 2023, which will be held at a location to be announced by someone other than me, but announced very soon, actually, probably within the next few hours. So stay tuned. But now, I'm very honored to welcome our keynote speaker. Dr. Asia Martinez is an assistant professor of English at University of North Texas. Her award-winning book, Counterstory, The Rhetoric and Writing of Critical Race Theory, makes a compelling case for counterstory as methodology through the well-established framework of critical race theory, reviewing first the counterstory work of Richard Delgado, Derek Bell, and Patricia Williams, whom she terms counterstory exemplars. Dr. Martinez is co-editor of the multimodal journal, Writers, Craft, and Context, and her scholarship has appeared nationally and internationally in several edited collections and in journals. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Asia Martinez.
Good morning. My talk today is titled a little differently from what I submitted for the program, but still within theme. It's titled Alejandra Writes a Book, a critical race counterstory about writing, identity, and the responsibility of privilege. The PowerPoint I'm working off of and the talk that I'm reading from can be found at this web address. I also uploaded them to the shared Google folders for today in the conference. So if anybody wants to get yourself there and follow along with the transcript, please do. I'll wait a few moments for anyone who wants to go there. Okay. I will also begin with a land acknowledgement, opening our discussion today as a descendant of the Yaqui and Wixaritari nations, and as a visitor on the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe Three Fires Confederacy of Ojibwa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi peoples. These nations have stewarded this land throughout the generations and have endured the genocidal effects of white settler colonialism. Their survivance continues. I pay my respects to elders and all our relations, both past and present. I'd also like to extend huge thanks to Dr. Grace Pregent, conference chair, to Josh Kim, conference coordinator, and to the many minds and hands who labored to make this conference and my visit possible. I identify first and foremost as a storyteller within a legacy and genealogy of storytellers. Robert A. Williams Jr. details the American Indian tradition of the storyteller as the one who bears the heavy responsibility for maintaining the connections of community, an intricate web of connections, kinship and blood, marriage and friendship, alliance and solidarity. And importantly, Williams centralizes the role of the ancestors, our grandmothers and grandfathers, and their grandmothers and grandfathers, all of whose stories are held sacred to the storyteller. They who share all of the stories so that the next generation will recall these narrative links between generations. To be a storyteller, Williams asserts, is to assume the burden of remembrance for a people. For the storyteller is the one who sacrifices everything in the tellings and retellings of story. My much chronicled protagonist, Alejandra Prieto, is inspired in name and spirit by my grandfather, Alejandro Ayala Leyva. His are the stories I was raised on. My grandpa's oral histories fed and nurtured our family's sense of self and place as Indigenous Mexican people in a country that has historically crafted master narratives that would cast us and people like us as those who have been conquered, as those who should shoulder a sense of shame at our Indigenous status as Mexicans and our minoritized status as US people of color. Yet the sustenance infused in me and my family from my grandpa's stories holds an illuminating candle of insight to other narratives, counter-narratives, to the overarching master tropes that would describe us as outsiders to be repatriated in my grandpa's generation, Americanized in my parents' generation, assimilated in my generation, and victimized yet defiant in the face of colonization in all generations. My grandpa's stories always provided us an agency through an alternative narrative. Thus, my identity, my very existence and sense of being, has always been tied to Counterstory. A student once asked if there is ever a point in which we, minoritized folk, will get to stop justifying the methodological choice of telling our stories. I believe that we've all been telling stories all along, but some stories are elevated to the status of theory, scholarship, and literature, while too often minoritized perspectives are relegated to marginalized or overlooked cultural rhetorics, methods, or genres. While I don't know when or if these academic gatekeepers will arrive at a point of admission that all work, especially in the humanities, is story, I do know that narrative has always been theoretical. My body of work makes a case for critical race counterstory as a rhetorical research methodology and method by reviewing counterstory through its critical race theory methodological origins and influences, while also analyzing and illustrating the methods of Richard Delgado, Derek A. Bell, and Patricia J. Williams, who I term counterstory exemplars. Delgado, Bell, and Williams are foundational critical race theorists whose respective counterstory methods of narrated dialogue, fantasy allegory, and autobiographic reflection have set a precedent for other scholars. As such, counterstory as methodology is the verb, the process, the critical race theory informed justification for the work, whereas counterstory as method is the noun, the genre, the research tool. My keynote today is a counterstory about a student of the Writing Center. I have made assertions in previous scholarship that counterstory as a method of critical race theory allows voices from the margins to become central to relating underserved students' own experiences within the academy. As asserted through the displayed epigraphs of Victor Villanueva and Rebecca L. Jackson, these narratives are crucial to understanding statistics beyond resulting master narratives formed about underserved students. Concerning my own scholarship and subjectivity as Chicanx, this counterstory is a response to this conference's theme, critically imagining writing centers, stories, counterstories, and futures. The stories I will recount focus on statistics specific to Chicanx in the academy and along the Chicano educational pipeline. As numerous critical race theorists and proponents of critical race narrative in rhetoric and composition have asserted, marginalized students are the experts of their own experiences and should be the purveyors of their narratives. Keith Gilliard notes the personal narrative as a primary database serves as, quote, an account that will further illuminate matters for those involved with the education of minoritized students, such as African Americans, American Indians, and Chicanx. I have crafted the stories I will tell today with the intent that the institution of writing centers and, specific to this audience, writing center administrators, approach underserved students with ears that will listen for that which they do not intellectually, viscerally, or experientially know. Krista Ratcliffe's oft-cited call for rhetorical listening is enriched by Nelson Flores and Jonathan Rosa's racial linguistic ideologies, a framework that examines not only the eyes of whiteness, but also its mouth and ears, all toward the understanding and belief that we as people of color can relay who we are on our own terms and in turn make change collaboratively. As this educational pipeline, gathered from US Census numbers, indicates, for every 100 Chicanx students who begin elementary school, 60% graduate from high school, and just over 10% earn a bachelor's degree. Writing centers concerned with serving students from underserved backgrounds should consider the journey of students along their educational pipelines as one informed by and resultant of educations not informed by ethnic studies or a critical, culturally relevant curriculum, pedagogy, and institutional practice. As a practice, unquestioned Eurocentric curricula, pedagogy, and program administration actively chip and strip away writerly identity from minoritized students. Yet this facet of the pipeline is rarely examined due to the sheer clamor of the master narrative that explains these dismal numbers away as factors of cultural deficiency on the part of the student, rather than cultural deficiency on the part of the institution. Related from a perspective counter to this master narrative, the counter stories I will tell next illustrate these data, humanize these data as narrative vignettes, snapshots of a sort, along the pipeline as I present evidence that writerly identities of underserved Chicanx students pre-exist the writing center experience. Writing centers, in turn, can best serve minoritized students when administrators and staff are trained to listen to, learn from, make space for, and perhaps even assist students in the rebuilding of a writerly identity. Engaging Villanueva and Jackson's recommendations of talking to students and centralizing their narratives, we can broaden the conversation about underserved students to instead include underserved students as we together address and refute institutional assumptions about who we are and the potential for our place in the academy. Okay, who's ready for some stories? All right. Episode 1, Alejandra, the writer, Pipeline Station, Elementary School. Alejandra always knew she would be a writer. In Miss Garcia's first grade state-mandated bilingual class, where English-speaking students were borderlands Chicanx and Spanish-speaking students had parents who were across-the-line Mexicanos, Alejandra Prieto, a little third-generation Español got stamped out of my parents during their schooling Chicana, was a lover of words, writing, and books in Ingles. When it came to books, this borderlands Chicanita never stood a chance. After all, her mother read all the baby books and dutifully read to her baby in utero as recommended in Baby Geniuses. It starts in the womb. Alejandra's father sat nightly in front of the TV eating dinner and watching his favorite quiz game show with his trusty tome of a dictionary at hand. Once a new word appeared on screen, Alejandra's dad quickly looked it up, pronounced it a few times, silently at first, letting the new letters and syllables swill around in his mouth, then aloud, tossed over his shoulder to his wife and kids at the kitchen table. Alejandra was raised in a house of books and words, research and definitions, so by the time she entered Miss Garcia's first grade state-mandated bilingual class, she was reading at a fifth grade level and knew she was a writer. When it came time for show and tell, All of the students were excited to find out their only task was to bring their most treasured possession to class. Something really special, Miss Garcia explained. Something only you have that only you can explain to us. Right away, most of the kids started chattering about which toy they would bring. Toys normally weren't allowed at school because Miss Garcia said they caused too much celos and too many pleitos, and she just wasn't going to put up with it. So everyone was excited to find out toys were in. Pedro declared during lunch that he couldn't wait to show everyone his chingon He-Man, and Marisol knew her Barbie with a growing trenza would be a hit with all her amiguitas. Miss Garcia even said there would be an extra 15 minutes of playtime after show and tell before everything would have to be put back into cubbies so they could go back to learning how to read again. Alejandra, eager for such a fun activity, also wasn't sure what she would choose for her own presentation. Her parents didn't have much money, so she knew the few toys she did have would probably not be very impressive to the others. And she also couldn't think of a single toy she owned that truly qualified as special and something only she had. Alejandra went home that afternoon with an expression her mom called cara pensativa, and when Mommy got home from work, she spotted Alejandra's quandary all over her face right away. Mija, why the cara pensativa? Miss Garcia said we have show and tell tomorrow, but I don't know what to take. She said it has to be special. Well, Mommy said, thinking, what about the bracelet Abuela bought you for your birthday? I wear that every day, Alejandra replied. No one's going to think that's special. Continued Mommy, a cara pensativa spreading across her own face now. Did Miss Garcia say it had to be something you already have, or can it be something you make? But what can I make? Said Alejandra. I don't have tools. Pues, of course you have tools, Ale. You have your brain and your imagination y tus manitas. Alejandra looked down at her small hands and thought for a few moments, and then looking up, said, well, the other kids are learning how to read. Yes, said Mommy, a look on her face like she already knew what Alejandra was going to say next. Well, I think books are special. Yes, said Mommy, a smile now spreading across her face. I could write a book and read it to my friends for show and tell, exclaimed Alejandra, light in her eyes. Perfecto, Mommy said, with light to match her daughters. Episode 2, Alejandra the Lawyer, Pipeline Station, High School. But you're always writing, said Cousin Chucho, accusation in his voice. Alejandra and her primo were sitting at their abuela's kitchen table, a place they spent all of their afternoon school hours before their parents picked them up after work. Alejandra could usually be found bent over her homework. Chucho was usually chomping noisily on comida and poking at her when things got too quiet. Ugh, Alejandra sighed in exasperation. I told you, Chucho, this paper is really important. If I don't finish it for a mock trial team, I'll be in deep shit. Ay, muchacha, tu lengua! A shout came from the adjacent living room. Alejandra and Chucho heard their abuela's recliner whine the way it did when she sat up abruptly, as the volume of her telenovela was lowered significantly. Now they had her full attention. Sorry, abuela, said Alejandra, a sheepish grin exchanged with Cousin Chucho's smirk. Malcriada, Chucho silently mouthed at Alejandra. Alejandra rolled her eyes at her primo, but they both remained silent for a few moments more until their abuela turned the volume back up. But the game starts in 10 minutes, Chucho continued, a slight whine accenting the 10. Are you really going to miss homecoming to write a stupid paper for a stupid law club? Chucho, came a yell from the living room again. How does she always hear us? Even with the novela full blast, Chucho hissed in a whisper. Déjala, abuela continued. Alejandra needs to write that paper. She's going to be an abogada, which you'll need someday if you don't stop being such a travieso. Chucho looked indignantly in the general direction of his abuela's disembodied voice. He took an angry bite of his quesadilla and vigorously chewed. His nostrils flared. Thanks, abuela, Alejandra trilled sweetly, following it up by sticking her tongue out at her cousin. He returned the gesture with a choice finger. Episode 3, Alejandra, the ESL student, Pipeline Station, four-year college. Alejandra couldn't believe her eyes. A B+++++. What the hell kind of grade was that? How was a professor even allowed to write that on a paper? And how many of those pluses would she have to earn to make it an A, or at least an A-? She had worked so hard on this essay. She employed all the strategies recommended in her freshman year English 101 course. Write a shitty first draft. Check, she did that. Have a peer take a look. Check, both Mommy and Boppy read it. Boppy, of course, fine-tooth combing it with his trusty dictionary at hand. Write a second draft. Check. She did it all exactly as directed and still resulting in a B+++++. It seemed her only and last option would be to actually attend office hours with Professor Kent, something she had avoided with most professors up to this point in her college career. But she was a junior now. She shouldn't still be afraid of one-on-one time with professors, even if it was a Shakespeare professor, who announced on the first day of class that he was a graduate of Harvard, who went to the institution back when they still gave you the option between math and Latin as a prerequisite. Dr. Kent opted for Latin. He let the class know, rolling his eyes as if math were a contender in the choice. So this was it. This was Alejandra's choice. Face office hours with this guy or be satisfied with the B+++++. Alejandra knocked shyly on Dr. Kent's office door. No answer. She knocked a bit harder, heard a metal chair scrape against the linoleum floor, and was soon sitting face to face with her professor. "How can I help you, Ellie?" said Dr. Kent. Alejandra winced internally at the familiarity with which he shortened and anglicized her name. Alejandra stammered, "I wanted to talk about my paper. The grade you gave." "The grade you earned," Dr. Kent interrupted cheerfully. "The grade you earned, my dear." Alejandra gave a slight nod and swallowed. "Okay," she started again. "Then about the grade I earned. Do you have the paper in question?" Dr. Kent asked. "Yes, it's here," said Alejandra, retrieving it from her bag and placing it on his desk. Dr. Kent picked up the paper, surveyed it page by page, then placed it back on the desk and said, "Well, this is a great essay, Ellie. Very nuanced understanding of the way Shakespeare is using Othello's character to get audiences to examine their own prejudices. Very good work. What is it you wanted to discuss?" "Well," Alejandra began in an unsure tone. "Project, my dear. Use your theater voice with this Shakespeare professor. From the diaphragm," he cheerfully boomed. "It's the grade," Alejandra sputtered, a bit louder, more forceful than she had intended. "It's a B+++++. I wanted to know what I'll need to do to earn an A. What you wrote on my paper says it's good, and right now you just said it's good, so I want to know what I need to do to get an A," Alejandra finished, a bit out of breath. Dr. Kent fixed Alejandra with a stare for a moment, just long enough for Alejandra to begin to fidget and look elsewhere in the room. Then he sighed and began, "Well, Ellie, I've been teaching in this part of the country for a long time now. And with the border to Mexico so close, I've become accustomed to my students having varying degrees of proficiency with the English language." Alejandra nodded her head, uncertainly, but well aware of Borderlands' versions of Spanish, English, and everything in between here in her hometown. "So," Dr. Kent continued, "I'm well aware that not all of my students are equipped to handle the language, and with your own ESL background," Alejandra blinked and shook her head. Did she hear him correctly? Did he just say she was an ESL student? Did he just say her writing was not at the A level because he assumed English was her second language? ESL. A status Alejandra could never claim because her own parents had been corporeally punished in their own educations for speaking Spanish. Her parents were punished to the point they never actually taught Alejandra or her siblings the language. Did Dr. Kent know she mourned the loss of this language? And now he informed her English was a tongue she hadn't mastered as well? Did he understand? On September 22nd, 2020, a mere 4 months after my book on CRT and Counterstory was published, the 45th President of the United States issued an executive order on combating race and sex stereotyping. This executive order states, many people are pushing a different vision of America that is grounded in hierarchies based on collective social and political identities, rather than in the inherent and equal dignity of every person as an individual. This ideology is rooted in the pernicious and false belief that America is an irredeemably racist and sexist country, that some people, simply on account of their race or sex, are oppressors, that racial and sexual identities are more important than our common status as human beings and Americans. And placing particular focus on our institutions of learning, the order continued, this malign ideology is now migrating from the fringes of American society and threatens to infect core institutions in our country. This executive order took specific aim at critical race theory as the ideology responsible for creating this supposed different vision of America. This executive order acted as the public launch of a new phase in the culture war aimed at silencing and distorting the stories of minoritized peoples. My engagement in the CRT field builds particularly on the powerful work of critical race theorists who define critical race methodology as a challenge to majoritarian stories or master narratives of white privilege. This methodology rejects notions of neutral research or objective institutional practice and exposes acts that silence and distort epistemologies of people of color. Importantly, critical race methodology recognizes that experiential knowledge of people of color is legitimate and critical to understanding racism that is often well disguised in the rhetoric of normalized structural values and practices. A critical race methodology includes a range of methods such as family histories, biographies, autoethnography, cuentos, testimonios, and counterstory. Through my years of work as a CRT researcher, writer of Counterstory, I've learned firsthand of Counterstory's potential for achieving social justice. A question I often encounter when speaking with audiences about Counterstory is, are all marginalized narratives Counterstory? While there are indeed many marginalized narratives, the measure remains whether the tellers and stories subscribe to CRT's tenets, particularly in their critique of a dominant ideology and their sustained focus on social justice as an objective. In other words, what are folk using Counterstory to do? Expression of minoritized subjectivity is a good starting point, but it is equally important to include the admission of and critical self-reflection on privilege. My privilege is that I am a very educated person with the platform of this project. The question then is, what will I do with this platform and privilege? What kind of project will I craft? What is my contribution? And further, as an audience member once asked, what is the political weight of this work? I believe the answer lies in what I maintain as one additional tenet for CRT: accessibility. Derek Bell's exemplary counterstories are bestsellers. Patricia Williams' work has been reviewed by mainstream presses as she continues to write a column for the popular press, The Nation. And Richard Delgado's work, published in law reviews, yes, has also been reworked as an introductory text for high school students. Their work continues to inspire and resonate across generations and disciplines. My writing process has included and always will include my family, non-academics, because the work is for them, is sometimes about them, and is nearly always inspired by them. And if my work in Counterstory is inaccessible to the very people it is for, well then what's the point? Why do the work if it's inaccessible? Thus, in my contribution to defining CRT, I advocate for the premise of accessibility in the sense that a methodological consideration for Counterstory should always envision a multiplicity of audiences beyond the ivory tower, so as to speak with, rather than for and over others' communities. In rhetoric, composition, and writing studies, Carmen Kennard has called for greater attention in the field toward critical race theory in order to better prepare as teacher, scholar, administrators, and activists to be institutionally and pedagogically anti-racist. Kennard has astutely observed that, quote, despite everyone's seeming incessant discussion of critical theories from post-colonialism, decolonization to intersectionality, theories can become merely the stage for an academic performance, not a way of engaging the world and oppression in it. Following Kennard's example, I believe it is crucial to use theory, methodology, and praxis that counter those who seek to dismiss or decenter racism and those whose lives are daily affected by it. Counterstory, then, is both method and methodology. It is a method for telling stories of people whose experiences are not often told, and as informed by CRT, this methodology serves to expose, analyze, and challenge majoritarian stories of racialized privilege. Counterstory can help to strengthen traditions of political, social, and cultural survival, resistance, and justice. And whether presented as primary text within class, assigned to students as writing method, or applied as a framework by Writing Center administrators to transform praxis, counterstories teach us that construction of another world, a socially and racially justice world, is possible. So, at the conclusion of this keynote as counterstory, the question remains, what can writing centers do to open space, provide pathways, and to help in the rebuilding effort for students with stories like Alejandra's? Further, how can writing centers encourage their institutions to follow suit? The challenge is ours. In closing, Writing Center administrators and professionals should aim to engage the narratives of underserved students not so much as cultural insight, but as an institutional indictment of the colonizing impulses that exist within well-intentioned and liberatory missions of writing centers. As Kwame Ture reminds us, institutional white supremacy exists within the fallacious notion that white people can give anybody their freedom. No man can give anybody his freedom. A man is born free. So as a caveat, a writing center is best positioned to truly serve the underserved when their conception of liberation is expanded to realize students possess an understanding of who they are as writers and how this relationship has been shaped, for better or worse, by the academy. It is then the responsibility of the Writing Center not to liberate underserved students, but to recognize its own complicity within the white supremacist functioning of the academy, to reflect on these white supremacist tendencies, and to build resistance and space with underserved students through coalitional practices that centralize the narratives of marginalized students as crucial to best serving their needs in this space. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Martinez. We are open now for questions. I do have the mic, and I'm happy to bring it to you. I see one in the back here. I'll get my steps in.
Hello, I hail from Texas of the Midwest, Ohio. Currently, we are having not great discussions about CRT, and I'm a student teacher. And I've already kind of made the decision that, hey, if I gotta get fired and go private, I'll get fired and go private if they're gonna like push ahead of the CRT stuff. And I've already been trying to kind of incorporate counterstory, mostly restoring, into my classroom right now with primarily like Appalachian adjacent white poor students. So they have a very specific situation where they don't understand the idea of white privilege at all because they're like, I haven't been privileged by it. And like they have, but they don't know they have, you know. And my first attempt with them was so bad. It was horrible. I gave them a Joy Harjo poem in comparison to a Washington Irving story where he used very racist anti-Native American, anti-Indigenous language I was like, okay, let's compare it to how Joey Harjo talks about land and identity. And they butchered that assignment, and some of them wrote racial slurs in the discussion posts I put up. So I was like, okay, we're going to take a step back. I'm going to work through it with them. And I got them to a point where they're able to compare Lincoln and Douglas pretty well by putting it in a vacuum and separating them from it and like making it feel historical. And I felt like I betrayed the entire point of CRT education when I did that, because it got them to engage with Lincoln and Douglas as people with ideas. But they remove themselves from it. So I'm wondering if you have any advice on, specifically with poor white student populations, how you can help them understand their historical position in these kind of really horrible black spots in American history. Because I think history should be part of the ELA classroom. So I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah, you teach that history, and you have them engage that history from their own families' kind of historical memories, because that's, again, where the work, I think, of Counterstory starts, is with the self, with that critical self-introspection. Patricia Williams' work is the method of Counterstory that models that the best, because she looks inward to then dredge up that which she needs to speak about as issues. But she's doing this as a Black woman. It's not exclusive to work as a Black woman. Poor white people can do that too. But Frankie Condon's work is, in particular, is I think the go-to, at least for me, in terms of how to nod white people in a direction of how to go about it. Because Frankie very explicitly says that this work can be mortifying. It's not always work that we want to do, right? Because it's not the representation of self. But Henry Louis Gates, in his review of Patricia Williams' work, said that what's so incredible and important about her work is that she's not always narrating from the subjectivity of victim. She's narrating from the subjectivity as perpetrator, witness, defendant, and sometimes victim. And those are all different subjectivities that in a writing practice you can play with, right? You can say, okay, so maybe because it's a little less taxing for students who are resistant, let's start with something we witnessed. Okay, what did you witness that maybe was that? And it's not always, especially with white students, the best move to start with people of color's work and words about what they do, right? Let's start with our own work and words about us and who we are and what we do and what we've seen, and then kind of go outwards as you're building trust with them, right? Because the thing that students need to fill is some semblance of trust. Maybe, I don't know that safety can always be guaranteed, but some version of that you're not doing this to gotcha, right, the students. And I think as a white instructor, you have more privilege in that regard than me. And these are my practices as a woman of color that I've been successful in using with students who have been predominantly white in a lot of institutions. So those are my recommendations to you. Don't start with the words of people of color, start with the white people and their experiences and getting them to do that self-digging. But again, Patricia Williams and Frankie Condon are good models of what that is. Condon. Yeah, and her book in particular is I Hope I Joined the Band, where she talks very explicitly about this. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, I'm also from Kent State University. I'm going to join my friend. So you just spoke about how to bring your ideas to student populations, but I'm curious about the other side of it where you said, as writing centers, how we can encourage our entire universities and institutions to adapt to these. And I'm really curious to see your thoughts on how, instead of bringing this to students now, we can focus on bringing this to institutions.
Yeah.
And I guess most specifically to professors, because it's often, as a peer tutor, our experience that we have students almost like shipped to us carelessly as like, go fix this writer. And we hate it, but we are not considered companions to professors. And so we don't feel we have the voice to say, please stop doing this. And there's a better way to do this.
Yeah. I mean, again, the harder work, but I think the more necessary work is at the institutional level, because we can do a lot of great stuff with our students, and students tend to get with it, right? Like they can understand. Some of it has to do with, again, finding opportunity, whether that again be in, I don't know, professional development sort of things or through writing that gets somehow dispersed through the institution, ways to tell stories of what this looks like on your end of things at the Writing Center. And so one of the books that just came out is Counterstories from the Writing Center by Frankie Condon and wonderful Faizan, who's alumnus of MSU. Yeah, we can applaud that. That's great. A lot of good examples of that kind of storytelling that can be worked into institutional levels of awareness raising. But I think, so the example that I did today with Professor Kent, right? In some ways, many of these professors think they know, right? They think they understand the functioning of, let's say, language, linguistic diversity in the place they've been a professor for 30 years, right? And so sometimes it's a matter of just kind of like bursting that bubble and saying, well, you don't actually know your students as well as you think you do, and here's something to consider. And back to the first question I answered, I think a great question from my experience in writing centers that it was important to pose with fellow professors is, how often have you had to communicate in a language that is not your mother tongue? And beyond that communication, how often have you had to write a formal academic paper in that language that is not your mother tongue? When have you been in that circumstance? When have you been in that situation? And so shifting the subject position to the professor, who oftentimes, at least in American universities, doesn't have to have language proficiency beyond English. That's not a requirement of our grad programs, not really, not seriously. And it's definitely not a requirement of the hiring process or annual review or tenure. And so these professors get to sit in judgment of students' proficiency that usually boils down to a couple things with prepositions or articles or whatever, right? It's like usually 2 or 3 issues that are being had that are just repeated throughout the paper. And so just having that almost like compassion for how difficult the role is of the student and how brilliant and proficient they are at what they are actually doing, whereas some of these professors couldn't be thrown into even another part of town and communicate proficiently, right? Let alone write a paper that is academic. And so, but again, it's hard to understand that if you've never been in that subject position. And so that's why I find story so important, because you can communicate that. And I've read this Dr. Kent story in other circumstances, and there have been professors in the room that are like, oh my God, I'm Dr. Kent. Shoot, you know, and some have been more congenial about it than others, right? Some have felt really called out or like I'm, you know, like I know them, and I'm like, I don't, but it's so common, right? And so whatever those stories are that are coming out of your experience in relation to what is happening in that writing center are important to document, to get onto the page, and to find creative ways in any alliances or associations you do have with other professors who might have more power or administrators who might have power to get people into a position where they are being made aware of this, or just being told they're going to hear a story, right? Because that tends to be, you know, disarming for some audiences. But that's my approach. That's my suggestion. Of course, it's not a solve it, you know, sort of thing, but it is a direction that writing center studies are going, especially with the new publication of the Condon and, or Faizan and Condon book. Yeah. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Natalia. I'm also from Kent State University. You know,
It's like
starting this
Kent State
conversation
monopoly
over
on
here.
questions.
Yeah, we have all the questions, but I'm looking more at like ESL writing and also linguistic justice with the concept of like, oh, there's more than one concept of like English. There's more versions of it, and most people are actually not native speakers that use it because it's a language created to have these communications within cultures. And my concept is like, what can we actually do to help writers reclaim their voice within this institutional standard of privileged English that they are kind of swayed to?
Yeah.
So what would be like your advice for
Yeah.
that?
So again, very specific to the work I do, because I admittedly am not up here as a writing center administrator, right? And I'm a writing teacher and a writing center worker. And so those have been my experiences in that regard. But part of what I found was interesting and important to do is to definitely have those more macro level conversations with our staff, you know, raising that sort of awareness about what is linguistic justice, right? What is linguistic diversity? What are the multiplicity of Englishes that exist? And sometimes, and this has happened to me before as a writing center tutor, students don't want to come in and talk about their assignment. They want to talk about why they were sent there. They want to know, you know, and that might be their first whole appointment, you know, a whole half hour of just trying to understand, especially if they're international students, what were the processes that are in place within that structural institution that made the professor eject them essentially into the writing center. Because some of them have even come to me and said, what is this? You know, what is this place? What is a writing center? What are we supposed to do here? Some of them are coming to me as people with advanced degrees from other countries, you know, so very proficient with language practices. But again, these professors who are not recognizing that. And so part of it is, are our staff prepared to have that conversation when it's needed to be had with the students? You know, sometimes, again, a whole first appointment or two might need to be just discussing some of these structural realities of English only in this country. You know, and understanding that politically, and do all our staff know what that history is, know how to speak about that, know how to engage students in helping them become aware and educated on what that is, even if it's not fair. Why is this happening, right? But then back to my answer to the previous question, the reason that I've erred toward Counterstory, and you'll see from the ones that I told today, is that you can craft characters and scenarios that engage these other Englishing or languaging practices. And that's part of the strength of what Counterstory provides, is that aside from maybe the more traditional academic form of writing, if you're crafting characters who have to speak dialogue to one another, there's certain things that have to be in place. Here's an example. Some of you have read my 2014 essay, A Plea for Critical Race Counterstory. There's two dialogues in there, one amongst white professors, another amongst a Chicana daughter and her mother. The first draft of that was too academic because I was writing it for my dissertation back in the day, and it didn't sound authentic to the way this mother and daughter would actually speak to one another. And so what did that result in for me as a writing and revising practice? It resulted in me sitting next to my mom on the couch and prompting her with the Alejandra phrases and seeing what my mom would naturally say in response. And that became what the second dialogue was, because that was what breathed life into the data. It humanized it, as I said. And so how many opportunities, and this is into like writing activity sort of thing, right? Like when we're in our writing classrooms, but how many opportunities do we give our students to write collaboratively with their families, right? Or their communities, or to engage writing practices that are breathed to life with the way the language would really sound and operate between certain interlocutors, okay? And so those are some of the approaches that I personally would take, but again, not expert in the overall aspect of it, but just what I've done, yeah.
Hi, I'm Catherine from Western Michigan University, and you talked a little bit about the institutional barriers and how we can use writing centers to address that, and also working with students. But I think there's kind of the in-between point that I know my writing center talked a little bit about last year, where it's our writing center consultant training and our practices and policies, and what we view as best practices for writing centers are not necessarily inclusive best practices. And so I'm wondering, I know that one of them has already come up, the linguistic diversity and transitioning from saying, well, there's correct grammar and we're going to teach it, to recognizing different voices. But within kind of our typical writing center best practices, our policies, and the institution of the writing center, what are some of those practices and challenges that you see as problematic that we need to revisit, so that we are, whether it's working with English language learners or multilingual students or students from diverse backgrounds, that we need to change?
Well, I think I'd want to maybe keep the mic. I'd want to know maybe what you're alluding to. Like, are there things that you're noticing that you're iffy about, just to help illustrate what you're talking?
Yeah,
what
so
your concern is.
one of the examples is a student I worked with last year came in, and there was the institutional problem where she said, I am losing a grade because of grammar and I don't know what's wrong with my grammar. And we looked at the paper, and she was writing in AAVE, African American Vernacular English, and there were not grammar problems. She was writing consistently in her own dialect. And so we had a conversation around, is this something where you want to correct your grammar to just match what your professor is expecting because you want this grade? Is this a conversation you want to have with your professor about the right to write in your own voice, in your own dialect? Or is there some middle ground you want to walk? 2 years before, I wouldn't have even known to have that conversation. I would have gone through and said, here are all the things that are wrong with your grammar right now.
Yeah.
So that's one area where I know I've seen some change, but I think there's probably other areas where we take for granted things about directive tutoring or non-directive tutoring, things about the way that we set up our appointment making processes or that we handle professor referrals, that it's harder to see when it's us than when we're looking at faculty.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think what you just described is, again, in line with what I would answer for that, is having the wherewithal as the tutor to have that conversation and to do kind of that negotiation with the student about, well, what is the goal here? And so here's what the professor's doing. Here is where you are. And so what can I serve? And again, this might be harder as the tutor, but maybe something that administrators can be helpful in is, okay, where does the line get drawn between me as tutor and me as advocate for you in the writing and the writing that you want to engage in this other classroom space? And so I know that can get kind of murky when it's students, on behalf of other students. There can be a lot of power in that too, because the collegiality factor isn't as much of an issue, right? But for administrators, in terms of best practices that apply to the overall center, there is room to be had for those conversations about where does advocacy exist in these practices, because beyond just having these conversations with the students and explaining why this is happening to them, what is next for the Writing Center? Is there some role of being sort of a mediator of a conversation between the student and the professor, if, let's say, they do want to approach the professor and ask for some flexibility on the professor's part in terms of, communicative things that they want to do in that paper? Do we just say, okay, go do it, good luck, and come back when the professor says yes or no or whatever? Or do we see ourselves as, and I know some people are maybe sitting there being like, oh, that's just an extra thing you're piling on top of us, right, in terms of things that we have to do. But when we're talking about revising best practices, maybe that is something, if your center's not already doing that, because I know a lot of great centers already do that kind of work, but is that something that becomes more formal in our understanding of ourselves and how we train our tutors and how we think about ourselves as administrators? Thanks.
Hi, my name is Kate DeHaan. I'm a consultant at Calvin University in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And I was just wondering specifically, you mentioned that Counterstory as a framework for writing centers, and how specifically using the method of Counterstory, what would that actually physically look like?
Yeah, so again, it does have to do with kind of the work that I talked about with the first question of doing that introspective look at what our practices are, what of those practices are informed by any kind of, colonizing functions or white supremacist practices, and then thinking through, again, and that's the hard work, right? That's the drudging work, thinking through, okay, so when we get a certain demographic of student, what is the story we already tell in the Writing Center about who that student is and what that student's needs are? And where does that story fall? Does it fall into the master narrative hegemonic category of ideological things, or does it fall into us engaging the counter story? And maybe the Writing Center doesn't know the counter story of that student because we haven't asked. We haven't, bothered to understand who that student or who that assumed demographic of student are. And so it really is at that more structural systemic level when it comes to writing centers of thinking how much of our operation is based on master narrative tropes and how much of it is engaging actively the counter stories that our students come to our space with. And there's work in that, right? There's work in asking students and not making assumptions, right, about certain demographic of students, because that's one of the tenets of CRT is to think about intersectionality, but also be anti-assimilationist in that. Or essentialist, sorry. Anti-assimilationist too. But intersectional anti-essentialist, right? And so not just lumping everyone into one category because we visibly see or think we know who and what that student is based on what their accent sounds like or what, you know, their outward appearances. So it really is thinking through, you know, that master narrative, counter narrative dichotomy within our space.
What do you mean by anti-essentialist, or what does essentialist mean?
So when we homogenize groups, right? So yes, I'm a Mexican-American woman, and there's a lot of assumptions that can be made about who I am based on that information that you're given, what my language practices might be, what my work ethic might be, what my background and cultural information is, you know, informing who I am and what I am. CRT and that tenet in particular would caution you to not make those assumptions that lump me together with every other Latinx, whatever, fill in the blank, yeah? Because of intersectionality, yes, I am Mexican-American. I do come from a working class background. I was a teenage single mom, but I also have a doctorate. I'm also able-bodied. I was also raised Christian. Okay, and so those intersections matter toward the practice of not essentializing folks, as so often happens when like voting happens, right? Like there's always, oh, the Latino vote. What does that mean, right? Those umbrella categories. And that happens in writing centers, right? Like, oh, okay, the international student. Well, what is that? Who is that? What does that mean? That means people from Canada and people from Japan, right? I mean, like, it's just like umbrella categories, err toward essentializing, and that CRT tenet would caution against that. And the way that you resist that is by talking, right, to your students and figuring out what are the intersections of their identity that inform their writing practices, their languaging practices, those sorts of things.
Hi, Aaron Wilder, director of the Marian University Writing Center. And this is a question much more about CRT in particular, relating to the slide that you shared about that kind of emerging culture war. We've kind of moved into a second phase of that. And at our university, there is actually going to be an anti-CRT speaker that's coming very soon.
Do you know the name?
What's that?
Who is it?
I would have to look it up, and I can get that to you in a little bit. Okay. But I see potentially Counterstory as a very, potentially very good way to the word I'm going to use is combat. I don't know if that's the word that I want to use, but it's one that's coming to mind.
Or to counter.
What's that?
Or to counter?
Yes, counter. Thank you so much. But to counter that, so do you have any advice for how, in those conversations about how to support students, some ways we can help guide, direct them in their response to this? What kinds of things we might be able to direct them to do? And the name is Tony Kinnett and Robert Evans.
Okay, I don't know them.
I think they might be very Indianapolis centered. So.
I'm like, they're the lower rung of the guys. I don't know her. No. So, yes, I've been asked to speak on this quite often. And the thing that has been so fascinating for me is that I've been doing this work since 2007. That's when I started as a grad student. Never in my wildest dreams could I have imagined by 2020 there would be this complete, national and even international attention to this issue. I was interviewed by Lithuanian public radio about this issue. Yeah, and again, never thought that I would be talking to Lithuanians about CRT. But what's fascinating about it, and what I like to I think is important for me to say is that I'm not a politician of CRT. I'm a scholar of CRT. I'm a researcher and teacher of CRT. And so with any audience I engage, I make sure, whether it's my students or broader audiences, to let them know that I'm not here to convince you all of anything. You know, like if you don't like CRT, you don't want to engage it, you can leave with all of that intact. I don't care. What I do care about is making sure you know what you're actually against. And so in terms of supporting students in this likely nonsense that's going to happen soon at your university, is making sure students are fully informed, and I'm happy to come and do that work, you know, like I'm available for hire. No. But no, just bringing in actual CRT scholars to inform and educate. It's important because what these conversations often lack is any knowledge of what they're rallying against. And I'm not satisfied with just saying, well, they just don't know what they're talking about and leaving it there, because that's not helpful either, right? The work for us as CRT scholars is to make it, back to that tenet, more accessible to the broader public, including younger students, because we haven't had to do that. We've only talked very insularly to ourselves, other academics, maybe across disciplinary lines, but we have not really had to have a public-facing conversation to the point where we're at the disadvantage because the opposition is good at the rhetorically public-facing conversation, even if it's wrong. And so as an educator, my move in these conversations is, one, let our audiences know, go through the tenets. If you are sitting in this audience and you don't know the tenets of CRT, you don't know CRT. That's just the reality of it. And so bring in people who do and let them educate you on that and beyond those tenets, because those tenets serve as a framework for then what is the methodology Counterstory. Instruct people on how to do Counterstory. How do we do this, very subversive practice that from K-12 teachers to religious people in Texas have been coming to me about and asking me to help inform them on. That's been a huge surprise of religious folks in Texas in particular, being like, what do we do? How do we do? Counterstory is a very accessible methodology. I just read you some, right? Like, it is purposely intended as that sort of a practice so that we are engaged in a broader conversation about the topic. So yeah, teaching students the tenets, teaching them the methodology of Counterstory, and giving opportunity for them to do this work is what I would say.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Over here. Hi, my name is Erica Jackson from Wittenberg University. And I wondered if you had any advice for minority or marginalized Writing Center tutors who are encountering these master narratives, I guess. I know personally there's been like an institutional awareness, I think, of like personally like Black Lives Matter movements and like an awareness of, I guess, just culturally of some things that marginalized people encounter, which is, I think, a great thing. And it means that we're having like good conversations in the classroom, but that also means that we suddenly get papers about these issues that are poorly executed, but maybe well-meaning, or that I might find like personally offensive or things like that you have to respond to in an effective and useful way. I wonder if you have advice on either emotional labor and protecting yourself, or on like the tone in which we respond to these kinds of papers, I guess.
Yeah, gosh. That's a huge question. I think that's also a writing center level and administrator type question, because what are the writing centers and their structure and the administrators and their leadership? What is in place for that kind of a situation? Because the one thing that, and again, please, I'm not saying this as a writing center director myself, so it's just thoughts and advice, is that what sorts of situations, when our tutors of color find themselves in those situations, what sort of protocols are in place to give tutors the opportunity to not do that labor, if that's what needs to happen? And do tutors know about that protocol that's in place where they can, opt out of an appointment and not be penalized for something like that? Because it isn't, the norm that has I guess, been incorporated into what we talk about as best practices to think about the ways in which our tutors will get slap in the face type of appointments, you know, whether it's the student acting out or their paper or them in concert with their paper saying and doing things that are harmful and hurtful to us. And so I would put the onus of that labor less on the student, the tutor, than on the administrator who makes it known at a structural level what your options are as a tutor in a circumstance like that, that you don't have to just sit there and do it unless you make the choice to do that, but that you have the choice, I think is the important part, that you have the choice to opt out without penalty and to have alternative options. And again, like, I don't have that completely fleshed out. That's a great question. It's one that I'll even think about more, but would love to even be in conversation with administrators of writing centers more about, because I think that we are in a different situation since 2020 in that heightened sense of, you know, racial violence toward, you know, the everyday person of color. So yeah, I think just having something structurally in place that offers options and choices that do not have penalty associated with them, and figuring that out in a collaborative way, back to what I was saying about Counterstory, ways informed by these tutors of color that tell the center, the administrators, those in charge, what their needs are that need to be met in a situation like that.
Hi, my name is Yvette Clemens. I work also at the Marian University Writing Center as a tutor. And I was curious if you had any advice, kind of going off of what Erin said, but for maybe those of us coming from private and or religious colleges where there's not as much freedom to kind of have our voices be heard and speak out against these things. So I was just curious if you had anything maybe in regards to that.
It's interesting to have it framed that way, because for me, it's been the state funded schools that seem to be sanctioned more, but I am in Texas right now where the state legislature is making a lot of, drawing a lot of lines in the sand. And so I think I need you to be more specific though about what in particular you mean, like in what instances your voices be heard or...
So kind of, it's been a lot this academic year of kind of, I hate to like put labels on it, but opposing ideologies and viewpoints. And there have been actually a couple of very harmful events that have happened that were sanctioned by our school that were allowed to take place. And then it was, they self-proclaimed conservative club on campus built a Berlin Wall that it was supposed to represent American freedom, something like that. And so then they put it in the middle of campus and then they spray painted all of these different things on there, and they're like, oh, this is what it means to be an American. And then they came at it with like actual like hammers and stuff and were like tearing it down. So like tear down the wall, but then also it was like parallels to, you know, political things. But then when students spoke out about it, they had a little town meeting just kind of out of necessity because there was a lot of backlash, understandably, but nothing was really done to actually address the situation. And so that has been a issue kind of consistently on our campus, especially as of late with things kind of happening, events, you know, things taking place that are allowed by the school that do not actually align with our school's self-proclaimed values, but that are allowed to take place. And then also, on the other hand, we have groups such as our Alliance that have had events canceled or not allowed to be held because they, you know, don't go in line with the school's values. So it's just a lot of kind of not being able to express countering viewpoints, or when those things that happen when there is, you know, people sorry, I forgot the word. But when they speak out against it, it is very often silenced or just ignored.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I feel like I'm right in there. Solutions that I have to that is not where I'm existing in the moment, because I'm in it. I'm right there in it, to the point where, the reality of my existence is that I've shown up to venues where I get briefed before the talk begins about my escape strategy with the plainclothes officer who is in the audience. I mean, that's the reality of a CRT scholar right now. And get trolled openly and constantly on social media, but also to my personal or my institutional email, from local high school teachers, people like that, like sending things about the disgrace I am and the, indoctrinating I'm doing. And so the only advice that I can say is just based off of what I'm doing is just continue to do the work. Because Derek Bell has a really wonderful quote that I'm not going to say verbatim right now because I don't remember it verbatim, but he says something to the effect that critics are almost, I think, like a reassurance that we're being heard, if not always appreciated. And so, and then Audre Lorde, your silence will not protect you. And so I don't think the move is ever to stop the work, even if we feel that it's, not showing the immediate results that we're expecting, or that no one's hearing, or it's an echo chamber. It's not, and someone's watching, right? Someone is. But I think that also comes from back to the question of privilege. Who are the privileged folks leading some of this, in the sense of not centering themselves, but using their power and their privilege to lead some of these efforts, put themselves out as accomplices, stick their neck out, and bear the consequences? Because that's the other thing I've seen at institutions, the private one that I worked at previous to the public one I'm at now, is assurances that there's support from white faculty in particular, tenured white faculty in particular, and then there's like the asterisk at the bottom of their support that says, but I support you in silence, right? And it's like, what does that mean? What does that do? Nothing. What are you afraid of? You're white and you have tenure, like, what is the problem here? But there is that fear. I've seen that fear. I've experienced it. And so I think it's just that matter, back to the intersectionality question. Intersections of oppression are one thing to look at, but what are the intersections of our privilege that we also need to be self-reflective of critically, and think about where we can put our voices, sometimes our bodies, sometimes our work, sometimes our best practices, sometimes our leadership within centers or institutions or programs, into practice, beyond just the hand-wringing and signposting that happens on social media about our frustrations, right? And so, like, doing the actual work and being steadfast in it is, I think, what's important in this moment. Just not giving up and not hiding, and knowing there will be consequences. There are consequences to the work I do, and that's the caution I give to students, is that you better mean it if you're going to do this work, because it comes with a certain territory, and it's not pretty and fun and sexy and cool, and the thing that, oh, we're all CRT scholars now. Okay, but you better mean it. You better mean it, because it's scary. People can find me, and they have. So that's the reality of it. But I do it anyway, and I think, and others are modeling that behavior that I'm following suit of as well. Yeah. Thanks.
Hello, my name is Joy Mays, and I am a writing consultant at Grand Valley State University. Okay. And forgive me if this is rambly at first, but when I consult with papers in Grand Valley State University, and I work with students who write in AAVE, I be sure to give them a debrief on linguistic discrimination, things of that nature, and just sort of kind of ask them whether or not they want to write in their own authentic voice, as they should be given the choice to, or if they want to write in the voice that the professor would prefer in order to get a better grade. And I've had students who preferred the former. And I just want to know, because this is difficult for me to deal with too, as a girl who's grown up in like inner city Chicago, with students who choose to write in their authentic voice and are unfairly penalized via a bad grade. How can we as consultants support them?
Yeah. I think it's a great question that dials back to, again, the culture of that writing center and what aspects of us are tutor and what aspects of us are advocate. And again, sometimes it's just a matter of being able to have that conversation, like you said you already do with students, to make students feel seen, right? Like they're not stupid and bad and wrong in any of the things that might be self-critical or might be critical from the actual professor coming toward them, you know? And so there's that aspect, but in the greater scheme of the writing center, there is that question of, okay, so beyond what I can do as the tutor, one-on-one and individually, what do we have in place to serve as advocates if the student wants that from us, you know, wants that on their behalf in relation to this professor, for instance. And I know every institution has a different, you know, approach to that, but that's a great question and conversation to have with your administrators within the writing center. And for them to importantly hear from you, you know, about what your, I guess, skills are that you bring to the table as someone who does have that ability to have that conversation with the student and understand and make them feel seen in certain ways. Thank you.
Just wanted to read a comment that we have coming in the chat from Janine Smith. Hi, Janine. Piggyback on the Kent State University tutors question.
Right.
Thank you for your wonderful response. As writing center directors, a large part of our work is to push back on the institutional pressures to be the language police. Post-pandemic, we directors have a perfect opportunity to work with faculty through faculty professional development committees and anti-racist groups. Connecting with faculty in these arenas is already making a difference. It is very like tutoring, but we're simply tutoring the faculty.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Well said. Yeah, agreed. Yeah, and I guess just as a closing thing is to never forget that we're always students in the process of learning, that you, with whatever degrees you have, do not mean that you're done, you know, and that's a bad frame of mind to get yourself into. There's always stuff to be learned, and I continually learn and consider myself a student of CRT and Counterstory as I progress with the work and engage with audiences. I always learn something new from the types of questions that I get asked, so thank you.
And that is all the time that we have for questions right now, but let's please thank Dr. Martinez again.